Has there been a lot of discussion of ChatGPT and related things in the media in your country?
Well, I mean, yeah, certainly because the teachers are starting to become aware of it, and it's
Mm.
mostly used for texts. I don't write essays anymore, so it's not something I can relate to, but yeah.
Yeah, it's the same here. The university put out like a 4-page official statement on the technology and how to. Well, a good thing about the University of Melbourne statement was that it wasn't entirely focused on, oh no, this is a disaster, how are we going to do assessment, but it was also stressing potential for using it in more interesting ways.
Oh, that's kind of an interesting take, given that it was a public statement from a university. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, I was mildly impressed, I suppose. We were just discussing, Matt, that the University of Melbourne sent out to all faculty. I don't know if you've seen it. There was a 4-page statement about ChatGPT and related technologies and what to do about them. And I was saying that I was mildly impressed to see that at least maybe a half of it was oriented around making good use of this opportunity rather than just freaking out about how terrible this will be for essay writing and such things.
Cool.
Maybe it's because part of it was written by ChatGPT.
Nice take. Yeah. Yeah, I do have to say that I cast a much more suspicious eye on everything I read now. Yeah, I do have to say that the bots here, for example, are rather keen to take an optimistic view of the technology. They'll talk about ethics and safety and so on, but fundamentally they have very positive orientation to the tech. I think that's probably just implicit in the training set rather than being something that OpenAI is like putting their hands on the scales. But still, it's kind of interesting.
I wouldn't be surprised though if, like, you know, they obviously have certain things that they very deliberately want to get the AIs to not say, or to say, like, avoid racism and stuff like that.
Mm.
Avoid techno-pessimism. That would be something that surely they would consciously be trying to um, think about. I mean, they're going to have to be controlling that from all of their staff members.
Right. Yeah, that's
Right.
interesting. I mean, I guess I know there can't be a unified view on that within OpenAI, so it'll be interesting to see how much that messaging is controlled. G'day, Adam. How are you? Can't hear you yet. Heeding all voices, listening in unison, our future awaits. Big stakes, Adam. You better say profound things when you open your mouth. I did see briefly a microphone icon above his head, so I think it must be working. Silently musing, reflecting on past conversations. Yeah, maybe that's what he's doing. You're thinking, you're pondering, you're a Taoist, Adam. You're not going to speak until you, because you know that knowledge is impossible. Well, we don't need you anyway. We'll just read out loud what Doctor says, and that'll substitute. You might have to reset, Adam. Awaken at last, Adam. Yeah, if you can hear me, you might have to quit out and come back in. Hello. Still. Adam. Can you hear me? Can you still hear us, Adam? Sort of weird. Okay. Yeah, I suppose it's possible quitting and rejoining might still do something. Yeah. Let me think. Hope it just works, I guess. So that's a bit ominous. Light of endless sun breaking through old walls and norms, a vision for all. It sounds like Sauron's eye to me. Maybe while we're waiting, I'll copy up that little 2x2 matrix that we drew some time ago. I think we called them last time accelerationists and precautionaries. I've seen people self-label themselves as accelerationists, so that seems like it was a good choice, but precautionaries is like a big mouthful. Is there a better word for that? I don't want to say Luddite because that has such a kind of pejorative flavor. Hi, Adam. Better? Oh man. Still no. Toot toot toot. Test, test, test. Test. Yeah, okay. Seems more than a few issues this morning. I don't know if you heard me before, Matt. I was asking if you have any better suggestion for precautionary as a label. Accelerationist seems right, but... Oh, you can't hear me either, Chad. I can't hear you, Matt. No.
Hey, Adam.
Okay,
Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
hear
I
Dan.
can hear. Can you guys hear me?
Oh,
now?
I can hear Adam now. Yes.
Okay, finally.
Did you guys restart the server?
I left and rejoined. I think we've all left and rejoined at this point. So.
Oh, I can't hear. Dan is super quiet.
Hello? How's that? Maybe it was the gain.
Yeah, that's better. That's much better.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Seems like we can get started. Hi, Adam.
Please.
Okay.
Please, Adam, say something.
No.
Once, there we go. Okay.
Okay,
can
you're
you
back.
hear me? Please tell me you
Yes.
can hear me.
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, there we go. All right, sorry for the disruption, despite the name of the seminar. Ha ha ha. Apologize for being a little late.
No problem. Welcome. Let's get into it.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I can set the stage a little bit. I think last we met in this seminar was 3 weeks ago. It feels like 6 months ago. Partly because of all the things that have happened in the interim. So maybe a brief recap. Since we met last time, Microsoft released its new Bing, which is probably based on GPT-4, codenamed Sydney. A bunch of tech companies have, in reaction to that, announced their own chatbot-based products. Bard was announced at Google, not released yet. Due to some issues, Google's stock price dropped like 10% the day after. Just today, ChatGPT has been released as an API. It wasn't available except through the web page before now. And the price per token is 10 times lower than it was with the previous generation, GPT 3.5. So the bots here are currently running on GPT 3.5. It was announced this morning. I didn't quite have time to switch them over to ChatGPT, but when I do, they'll cost 10 times less. And probably at similar levels of performance. So that's pretty dramatic. I was predicting that, but I wasn't expecting it for probably a few more months. So there we are. The whole world continues to go crazy about ChatGPT. My university has released a document about it. I imagine most institutions have, educational institutions have done so. So yeah, I guess one of the topics we want to talk about today is revisiting the timelines discussion. Probably we can update that a little bit. Basically, we were expecting some event would push people from various timelines to other ones. We suggested GPT-4 would be it. I think it's more appropriate to just say it already happened, and that's what ChatGPT achieved, at least in the public eye. So we'll revisit that. We can revisit, there's a discussion from the 24th of November last year about AGI and politics. I think maybe you weren't there for that, Adam, if I remember correctly. Does that ring a bell? We talked about like left versus right and the different political coalitions that are likely to emerge and so on.
I think I did. I think there might have been several sessions that touched on that, but I suspect I missed at least one of them in there.
All right. Okay, just give me 1 sec. I have to reset the listening account for the bots. Okay, I'm back, and hopefully they should be able to hear us again. Okay.
Your volume is very low again, Dan. Sorry.
Testing.
That's a little better.
Okay. Yeah, maybe let's just start with putting back up the graph that we had in that AGI and politics discussion, and we'll just naturally talk about timelines as we go, I think. So I was asking just before, so this is a 2x2 matrix. I'm going to put political left and right, meaning the Western left and right on the bottom, and accelerationists versus, I don't know what label to give this other category. We were calling them precautionaries last time. I don't know if anybody has a better name for that. I don't want to say Luddite or, Butlerian jihadi, but something along those lines.
One theme that comes around is like you gotta aim. So maybe these are people who spend a lot of time trying to aim this progress, like figure out what the goals are that we should be actually aiming for or something like that. Because I think people in this camp are like, well, at least some of them are like, yeah, progress and technology is great in principle, but I'm worried that the particular generation of technology is going to sort of go in a bad direction. It could be something to do with that. That's also, I mean, I think I like precautionary.
Yeah. I guess precautionary is not the name of a group. We were saying like precautionaires or something. Not that we need to get bogged down in this, but that is a bit awkward. Yeah, I like the idea of focusing on alignment or direction. Well, what camp would you say you're in, Adam? I think you want things to go fast in some sense, but you wouldn't.
It's an interesting question. I probably won't surprise anybody that I'm on the left side of this particular axis we've drawn politically, but I think I'm probably leaning into the accelerationist camp, but mainly for practical purposes. I mean, I am eager to have the potential benefits, which seems stratospheric to me in the fairly short, certainly even in the medium term, from AGI especially, but just AI in general, just the AI acceleration of technological advancement in its most, not naive sense, but just in the sense that narrow AI will accelerate human scientific progress and technological advancement. So I'm very eager for civilization to realize those benefits. But that's not my primary motivation. I think in pragmatic terms, my real concern is that I have not seen any plausible proposal for how to de-escalate the arms race here. I have not seen any plausible suggestions for how regulation or other means of incentivizing or disincentivizing the development of this technology produces an outcome that's better than than enabling the best among the available candidates. In other words, we're in a situation of choosing the lesser of many evils here, but enabling whichever is the least worst contestant in this race to have the best opportunity to actually win the race. And I'm not normally a very cynical person, but I very strongly suspect that the field is quite full of candidates that are racing towards the development of either, well, at the very least, a non-sentient, non-agentic AGI, sort of an Oracle-style AGI. And if not that, then a fully agentic and sentient AGI. I cannot imagine that it is only Google and OpenAI and Meta and a handful of other major mega corporations that are in this race. I can only imagine that there are potentially multiple governments, certainly the United States, certainly China, and very likely half a dozen or more other governments that are also in this race. The prize is so staggeringly large to the victor that it just seems to me completely crazy and irrational to not at least have a horse in the race at this stage. Now, maybe there'll be dropout over time. Maybe France will just give up the ghost, or maybe Australia will think it can't possibly win or something like that. But I'm imagining that there is a massive race going on, and we are not seeing all of it. We sort of see a little bit of it because we have a little bit of a view into public, like literally publicly traded companies, and that's it.
Do you really
we
think
do not
that?
see the full picture, certainly, and so because I have so much concern about the fact that the arms race is unavoidable. The best scenario I can see is to support someone who would be the best candidate to win among, not necessarily a great field of candidates, certainly not an ideal field of candidates, and so that is why I am sort of, what is the right word? I am regretfully an accelerationist, I think.
Good. Yeah, that'll make the discussion more interesting. Okay, let's we can pick up and talk about many things in what you just said, but maybe let's try and get on the board some of the entries in these quadrants to inform the discussion, perhaps. I like Kubernetes, or that's a great term for this. So, as Matt was saying, Wiener coined the terms cybernetics based on this Greek word Kubernetes. I don't know how to pronounce it. Okay, so what we kind of sketched out last time were the following elements. So on the left, in the precautionary camp, I guess you would have not only these camps, but there are, well, I guess there are existing political coalitions or movements which we can try and map onto these axes, and there are also predictions we might make of how they might move, but also new entrants, right? New groups that will form in reaction to this technology, which, again, as we've said previous times, there's a lot of uncertainty around timelines. We don't know what's going to happen, but in the timelines where things are short, so this is happening within 10 to 15 years, say, we are woefully unprepared, and I think we should adopt the attitude that short timelines are true for the purposes of just talking about what we think might happen in order to have some kind of basic roadmap in our heads that we can map events onto as we proceed. So this is, I think, meant to take place under the assumption that we're talking about relatively short timelines. Putting that aside. Okay, so on the left in the Kubernetes we have anti-tech, we have environmentalists, or at least the kind of tech skeptical part of the environmentalist movement. Here I would say AI ethics. I mean, AI ethics is a broad field. I think it's unfair to lump it entirely on the left, but broadly speaking, I think it's accurate. I think as a social group, it seems to me that most of the people who would call themselves working on AI ethics are on the left and are concerned about this for reasons that are typically attributed to the left, things like social justice, although that's not a purely left concern, of course. And then there's people who are just anti-big tech in general. And maybe anti-big tech is the wrong way to say it, but under that umbrella I would put say Snowden, or anybody who is very concerned about mass surveillance. So that would include me, for example. So those kinds of concerns, of course, become exacerbated and are really in some sense the same concerns to a large degree as what you might be concerned about given the power of AI.
I think I would add a nuance. Maybe it's already in anti-big tech, but I would say anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
And which is maybe a little bit bigger than corporatist per se. There are, although those two blend into one another. Yeah, I'm sure you see what I mean there. The concern being that this new technology will only extend a trend in which power and wealth accumulate in the hands of a relatively small minority of the global population.
Degrowthers, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of these terms have anti or d in front of them. I don't mean to at all paint the bottom left as full of stupid people or something. That's not.
Well,
not
it is.
intention.
I mean, these terms are not an accident, a mere accident of language. I think, and I write about this in my book. Sorry to be crass and bring it up, but one of the problems, for example, in the environmental movement is that it is not inspiring and is not strategically effective to only be against things and not for things. And it's so that in the short to medium term, aiming at tactical victories, being pessimistic and fighting against things can be extremely effective. But in the longer term, and thinking strategically, so if you want to win wars and not just battles, you have to have an overarching, affirmative and positive objective and vision and associated set of values, and that is what is missing. And the ones that are available for these groups are often dismissed or belittled as in a cynical way as being naive. So, for example, like what is the opposite of being against growth or anti-growth or something? Well, it's easy to sound like you are utopian, for example, and then we belittle that as being naive or silly. And so there's a destructive set of consequences that's associated with only being against things. And so I don't think this is a mistake of language. I think this is quite a revealing feature of these positions.
Cool. In the top right last time we put, I guess Sam Altman has become an important political figure of our age. So maybe it's worth mentioning him by name. VCs, just sort of capitalists in general. I guess it wasn't clear last time we discussed this that big tech really belonged up here. I mean, clearly they were accelerationist, but not in perhaps I think it was a lot less clear what the political orientation of the big tech firms was. They've been moving to the left quite a bit. Now there seems to be quite a serious tack against some of that movement. I'm not going to put big tech up there because I don't think on the left-right axis it really makes sense. I do think, however, that putting people like Peter Thiel up here makes sense. Just to briefly recap, last time we discussed this, I was riffing on a speech that Thiel gave in which, well, I'm putting words in his mouth a little bit, but he said something like, just don't choose totalitarianism. So in reaction to calls for imposing global restrictions on AI development that are extremely tight, and in order to stop humans from going extinct from AI risks, for example, he would see that, I think, as being a bit analogous to the kind of worldwide totalitarian government you would need to prevent any kind of markets if you had a communist system, for example. So I think he's saying that even if you see risks from advanced AI systems, first of all, growth is the highest ideal you can aim for in some sense. It's the enabling factor for human progress. So bet on growth and bet always against totalitarianism, which seems to be latent, at least in Thiel's view, in some of the attempts to think about how we might actually prevent AGI from arising before we're ready, which could take a very long time. So Thiel definitely is on the right and definitely is in the accelerationist camp. I guess I would say for similar reasons to what you were saying, Adam. He's very concerned about competition with China, for example. Any others we can put in the top right that I haven't mentioned.
Does anyone know what Palantir has been up to with respect to AGI? Because, I mean, my understanding of this is Peter Thiel's company. My sort of caricature of it that I use to understand the world is that it's like a shadow version of the very visible big tech companies like Google and Facebook. I wonder if it's sort of a serious competitor also in the AGI space. If anyone
Yeah,
knows
good
anything about
question. You have to imagine that I don't know what the company is that, for example, the Pentagon would turn to when Google rejected Project Maven, right? There's clearly a lot of money to be made in supplying advanced AI services to the government, to the mass surveillance institutions within the government. And big tech historically has sort of had a lot of resistance from their employees in trying to do that. So presumably somebody's trying hard to do it. I think it would be a reasonable prediction that Palantir is. I haven't seen any rumors about that, but I tend not to read much about Palantir either. Maybe they're quiet, or maybe I'm just not paying attention.
That's what I mean by the kind of shadow part. They kind of don't try to be in the public eye.
But I think we can probably put defense up here.
Some of these, could you clarify what your thinking is with regard to defense and the right side?
Yeah. What do we mean by left and right here exactly, I suppose? Well, the purpose of this exercise is mostly to diagnose what people out there are going to do rather than analyzing the ideals underlying their movements, right? So whether or not, say, the Democratic Party in the US truly is any more left in some ideal sense than any other group is sort of beside the point from the point of view of this exercise, I think. So why is defense on the right? Well, maybe I mean more the military-industrial complex than the defense institutions within the government. Maybe that's more precise. I think it would be accurate to describe the military-industrial complex as right-leaning politically. So Raytheon, Boeing, etc.
Is that because they're in the sort of economic right and they're pro-business because they are big business, or is it something to do with the sort of social? Maybe they're more inclined to be kind of nationalist and protect American values or something like that.
I would say that,
and that's
yeah.
sort of social.
I would say both, but primarily the former. Yeah. So,
okay.
I mean, the VCs, they will be socially quite liberal and not necessarily very nationalist or anything, but they are pro-big business, pro-low regulation, pro-free market, pro-small government, typical kind of libertarian / classical liberal leanings, whereas the left camp, I'm thinking more concerned with individual rights, human rights, social justice, more concerned with redistribution than the generation process for wealth, and those kinds of things. What would you say, Adam, to that?
I think in the case of, for example, the military-industrial complex, I mean, these things vary from country to country, what left and right means. I think since we're focused on sort of the operational aspect or dimension of this categorization, I think I would say that military-industrial complex is in the correct column, the right column, because of where its incentives are, and its self-sustaining. Oh gosh, what was the term that social theorists use to describe an organization that is self-sustaining? It kind of not reinvents, but oh, I'm drawing a blank here, you guys. I'm sorry. Institutions, social institutions end up evolving to, not consciously at all, just as a natural phenomenon. They end up evolving take advantage of incentives that allow them to reproduce themselves over time, to reconstitute, to sustain, to reproduce themselves over time. I think it's reproduce, actually, is the term I'm looking for, the formal term. And so so from that perspective, from sort of a sociological perspective, I think the military-industrial complex looks to America's voters on the right side of the political spectrum for support, and that is about nationalism and jingoism and the general, broadly speaking, political orientation of armed service. The men and women in uniform tend to be on the right side of the political spectrum, and the support for the armed forces, for defense in the name of national security and just sort of again, this may be uniquely American, it may not be, but sort of the traditional American isolationist and unilateralism kind of stance that's based on American might and power. Those are things that are associated with the right side of America's political spectrum and not the left side. And so that's on the sort of who is voting for politicians who support the military-industrial complex is voters on the American right in the case of the United States. And so that's one major set of incentives, which is the voting blocks within the America's political scene. And then the other major set of incentives is economic, and then that would be where is the funding for the military-industrial complex coming from, and that is via the political pathway. So it's via federal funding and state-level funding. And who controls that funding? Well, that's down to politics more so than America's bureaucracies, than its government bureaucracies. So I think it really does. It comes down to who has the political support among the voters to sustain the military-industrial complex, and that would be the voters on the right in the United States. Now, that may differ worldwide, and again, it may not align with in any coherent way with the ideals philosophically that underpin what are traditionally defined as left and right internationally, but I would say that that's the correct categorization certainly for the American military-industrial complex. That would be my read of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's implicit we're talking about the US, which is worth noting in itself, right? It's the political orientation of groups in Australia is, to first approximation, completely irrelevant to how AI shapes the species. Maybe that will change, but for the moment, I think it's appropriate to focus on US and potentially Chinese politics around AI.
Yes, I would say so. Although I would, we can talk about this later, and it is an open question that I'm interested in posing to you guys, which is, who can enter this race at this point, like which entities? And this is relevant to the military-industrial complex and the relationship between government entities and private contractors for the development of technology and engineering solutions, and even the conducting basic science in interest of those things. But my impression is that the contracting often goes out to research and development where that needs to happen, and then to implementation, the actual building and operating and running of products and building and operating of products and the running of services, the provision, I guess you might say, or production at any rate, of those services can be done by private contractors. But there are circumstances under which the government in the United States will undertake things itself. And I think that's a limited set of circumstances. I think one of those circumstances is when no real innovation is necessary, and it was for a number of different reasons, not least of which that the government, certainly in the United States, does not always have access to the top talent. It depends on the circumstances, and there have been historical exceptions. The Manhattan Project, for example, is a historical exception. But in general, the very, very best software engineers are not going to be working for any government agency. They're going to be working for Google and SpaceX and whatever else. But if that's not necessary, and all you have to do is throw resources at something, because the pathway is known and not a whole lot of innovation is required, just a lot of money and a lot of hardware and a lot of dogged work, then I think that opens the possibility to more legitimate government efforts. in a given direction or towards a given aim. And my open question there was how relevant is that in this situation? Is the current state of published knowledge and the current state of implementability such that you just have to throw resources at this now and you can have a fair shot at getting across the finish line? Or do we think that there's a massive amount of detailed innovation that's still required? That will shape who the real candidates are, the horses in the race. And it may also be shaping who is in which camp here and who are likely, like, who'd you place your bets on? So anyway, this is just sort of background that I wanted to bring into any discussion we have, but it's certainly relevant in my mind in this discussion. So sorry to kind of shoehorn that question
I think that's good.
And set of ideas in here, but
yeah, I think the analog of the Manhattan Project should loom in our imaginations as we discuss this. Let's come back to it though once we've filled in a few more of these quadrants. I do want to make a comment on that. So the top left, last time we put sort of techno-environmentalists. I guess there's a variant of somebody who's read your book and is a believer, Adam, who would go in the top left. Maybe that's you, right?
Well, for most technologies, but we only very hesitantly with AGI because of the staggering risks. I don't see a whole lot of risk with solar panels by comparison. But I see a hell of a lot of risk monkeying around with AGI, especially. If it were only AI and the G were not really in the offing, then I would be far less bashful about being in this top left quadrant. But on this particular issue, I'm hesitantly in that quadrant. It's only because of the particulars of the situation and an arms race kind of condition that I'm not down in the bottom left quadrant on this one. I mean, if there were a plausible way for us to go slower and not worry about a worst case actor winning the race, I would definitely be in the let's slow this whole business down camp for sure.
Yeah, I put up there neo-communism.
Or at least let's proceed with maximal caution. And I would have been exactly the same with nuclear weapons, for example. I mean, there are technologies with such destructive potential that I think you'd have to be pretty crazy to want to rush madly headlong towards the finish line. And yes, I looking at that on the side. Sorry, I've just noticed it now, Dan. You've written Manhattan Project there, and I think there is a lot we can learn, especially about the arms race conditions and the motivations of the groups that were involved in that race.
Yeah. So neo-communism is. So my wife's parents are visiting us in Australia. She's Chinese. They're from China. They've been hearing a lot about ChatGPT. I would say ChatGPT is even more universally present in the Chinese media than it is in the West. Many people are crossing the firewall to use it. Everybody's talking about it. It's not clear. Partly that's just Chinese people in general are more optimistic and willing to adopt new technology. Because I guess in the West we had a burst of technological progress, but fairly anemic growth for a long time. We've become quite cynical about it. I would say the default public attitude towards technology and science is kind of skeptical on the back of climate change and nuclear weapons. It's kind of got a tinge of maybe this is not going to work out so well. Maybe we're making a Faustian bargain involving all this tech in our lives. That's a background kind of thought in the West, in the public mind. In China, it's really not like that because they had their catch-up growth much more recently, and they remain, by default, very optimistic about new technology. So I think the discussion is quite different in China. It's unclear what the government's plans are around it, and there are hints, actually, that the government is much more worried about AGI than the Western governments seem to basically be agnostic about it or see it perhaps as a good thing so far.
For example,
sorry?
What kind of hints?
Yeah, I've seen comments from Chinese researchers that that you really shouldn't be talking about building superintelligence in China. The officials will not fund such work, and may even you sort of get the feeling that you'll be watched a bit if you're aiming at something like that. So maybe it's anecdotal, but I think that's consistent with the Chinese government's attitude towards, for example, Bitcoin, right? Very aware of the potential for disruptive technologies to disrupt them, and that's their primary framing on any technology. And clearly, AGI has the potential to do that. So I think they see it as a competitive. It's important to develop something along those lines to be competitive, but maybe much more worried about it knocking them out of the apple tree than, say, the American government is.
So there's one version of being worried about the development of AGI, which is existential, like mutually assured destruction kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it seems like maybe they would be cool if they were the ones that were making it. Is that?
I think so, yeah. But I think they're... at the top level of the CCP, there are lots of very smart people who I think are doing more careful analysis often than anybody at the top levels of the American government. And many of them will be looking at AGI and concluding that, well, the structure of society after this arrives will be very different. And our probability of being in control of that process is not necessarily very high. So I think they're trying to get ahead of that, and that's why I write neo-communism. There's still a very strong political current of real communism in China, and it has resurged in some sense with Xi Jinping. It's complicated, and it's always kind of stoked for nationalist kind of cynical reasons. But there are genuinely people in important positions who see this as an opportunity to make good on the promises of communism. And I wouldn't take that lightly. I think there's some probability they will try if they think that this is going to work. So, yeah,
I guess I would add in with neo-communism other sort of utopian idea. Not naive per se, but certainly idealistic. Aspirational, so idealistic aspirations and groups that subscribe to technology-based positive outcomes. I'm trying to avoid the word utopian, but I guess there isn't really any way around it. So techno-utopianism can encompass a lot of different political visions for the future. So anarchism is one, but communism is another. I know that's kind of ironic, right? Given the differences between those two views. But you could imagine sort of post-scarcity visions of, the economy. Oh yeah, I think you've got it already there. Transhumanists, the singularity crowd, I think has got certainly accelerationist, I think, for the most part. And my impression broadly of the singularity crowd is it's center to center left in the United States. It's not populated, to my experience or knowledge, largely by, or even to any real degree, by people who are on the right hand of the American political spectrum, certainly on the right hand of the voting divide in the United States. So yeah, I would add, you've got it added in there, that sort of the utopian and transhumanist sort of groups. I suppose we got to figure out who we want to put on this chart. Who, as in, are we going to include folks that are not unlikely to have any significant impact on the outcomes, and we can ignore those group or small numbers of people that don't, are unlikely to have an impact? I can think of. Well, so say here's another example. On both the left and the right, you sort of have nihilists, right? You have sort of nihilistic and misanthropic folks who just are like, bring it on, bring on the chaos, let the world burn, and it couldn't be anything worse than it is now. Let's welcome our robot overlords, kind of thing. Why not? But these people are, that block is unlikely to exert any real influence over the outcome. I suppose maybe if that becomes meme-ified in the public consciousness and in social media or something, maybe it could have some impacts. But yeah, we I would say that for the most part, we should be thinking primarily about groups or even individuals that could impact the outcomes. And it may be worthwhile listing the positions of those of others that are unlikely to have an impact. Maybe there's some usefulness in that, but in other words, I can think of a few things that go in each of these boxes that are not likely to have make any difference, and we probably want to ignore most of that, right?
It depends. I mean, if you have thought of like all of the paths to them having impact. For example, take transhumanism. This is a philosophy that so far has been, I think, widely dismissed as because it just sort of runs counter to some people's sort of very strong intuitions about like what is possible. And if you're familiar with the expression, is sort of like they're talking about things outside of the Overton window. But if technology kind of changes, this could become like a mainstream idea that maybe people start to adopt on much larger scales. Because, for example, the singularity starts to become possible and like plausible, and people say it. Either then at that point they say, "Oh, actually, I think that's a terrible idea," or they say, "I think that's a great idea." Like that could become a dividing
It's actually
line.
interesting. Yeah, it's actually interesting you say that. I've seen more of the realization that, or at least expression that it's a terrible idea, than embracing it as, wow, this is really cool, and we're actually closer than to this whole transhumanist thing than I thought. I've broadly speaking been, if not actively a transhumanist, then certainly sympathetic for my entire adult life. I mean, and many people who I know who are science fiction fans lifelong are broadly speaking in that same camp. They're sort of excited about the possibilities for the expansion of of the human condition and what and what might be possible. But what I've seen recently is really kind of took me a bit by surprise. There's been quite a strong pushback against long-termism as there's sort of some philosophical legitimate philosophical weight behind this view of effective altruism and some of the long-termist logic that's behind it. But
I think it's more a pushback against utilitarianism than long-termism, but yeah, I guess those
I suppose, except that the folks are saying, well, part of this vision is that people are going to live so much longer, and so that we have to think about not only future human beings, but also people today who will still be alive in the centuries in the future. And anyway, there's sort of a naturalist or essentialist gut reaction against that, and I was surprised to see it as strong as it is but I guess I don't know, that's probably for another conversation, and that's all muddied up in people who are pushing back against billionaires and and cryptocurrency and stuff, which is somehow strangely through odd turn of events associated with the effective altruism movement because of the folks who were behind FTX, that whole scam. They were making big donations or contributions in the name of this philosophy, and anyway, it's kind of a big mess. But I would say that the point, the argument that we could see a sudden polarization of public sentiment with respect to transhumanism, I think that's very plausible. It moves from the realm of silly, far-fetched, distant, far-flung science fiction, future, and fantasy and sci-fi, and moves into the realm of, oh my gosh, all this stuff, this could become real a lot sooner than we thought, in the same way that Captain Kirk's communicator became real, in a lot faster than 300 years, right? So, I think that this is a very interesting thing potentially to think about. Yeah, and one more thing is that the transhumanists have a political party in the United States. There's a political party. They're pretty well organized. They've been on the ballot. They had a presidential candidate, Zoltan something or other. His name is straight out of science fiction. That's cruel, actually. I think he's just of Turkish descent, so it's Sultan. But anyway, it is not a nothing group yet. The potential for polarization around this seems to be quite extreme. So we'll see. Yeah,
I'd like to give my take on this. I think the transhumanism putting it there, I'm not entirely comfortable with, because it doesn't make sense to me. Maybe most of these people are like, bring on the singularity as soon as possible because I can't wait to be a mind upload and live forever and be immortal and stuff. But if you sort of broaden that and include people in the effective altruism sort of movement and the long-termists, this also includes people who are worried about global catastrophic risks. And I don't think that people who are thinking about existential safety are, they would only be looking forward to AI if they thought it was going to go well. But a lot of them think that there's actually a lot of risk, and the AI alignment and stuff is really hard, and there's a big chance, or at least a credible chance, that it will go horribly wrong. So if you want to be a transhumanist because you want to kind of reach the singularity or whatever, you got to think, is acceleration then the right move? And I think at least some of the people who are, maybe they're not transhumanists, but at least some people who are in the camp of existential risk warriors would be, by definition, like, well, hang on a second, we should try and steer this a little bit more carefully. And maybe that is not compatible with accelerationism. And we're only in accelerationism maybe a little bit uncomfortably, like you said, Adam, where, it's because we actually, not being the ones who are running the company that is making the AGI is actually a bad move, because then it's going to be made by someone else. But if all else was equal, I prefer to sort of slow things down. I was going to say something else as well. I think, I'm interested in your take on the transhumanist community that whether they are, why they would be described as accelerationists. Is it because they're also optimistic about the sort of risks, like they would think that the risks are not to be worried about from AI?
If that question is for me, I'll just very quickly. My impression from the community discussions I've seen and been part of is that the AI and AGI both, and ASI, artificial superintelligence in particular, are viewed as sort of these magical, almost, and perhaps with good reason, but they are presumed. Let's say this: they are presumed to be technologies that are enablers of extremely powerful acceleration of technological progress, in perhaps the same way that computers once were. Prevailing view in the community is that the development of powerful AI, AGI, and ASI especially will telescope these what are today science fiction technologies, like mind uploading. You mentioned that's an example of one, but many others that are far out of our reach right now. That the way to bring those quasi magical technologies within reach, within the lifetime of the people involved, is via the power of artificial intelligence as a means. And so I think that's the main thinking there. There are also, and I have to say this as well, is that there are many, at least now as the community ages, because I think there are quite a few transhumanists who are now certainly older than me, even quite a number in my parents' generation. Some of them are running out of time here. And so there's huge interest in accelerating longevity research in particular. I've seen a lot of that. And maybe that I may be biased because there legitimately has been a fair amount of progress, exciting new progress in the last several years in the longevity and anti-aging technological fields, the fields that are related to that. It's early days, but there's been some exciting progress. And so people are very keen to accelerate up that curve. That is probably why I've seen mostly accelerationist views, but that's not to say that people are oblivious to the AI alignment problem. People are certainly aware of that and concerned about it.
I think there's a point here that you might be missing, which is when we say we're concerned about existential risk, we mean existential risk of humans as they are roughly construed today. If you take a broader definition of humans that includes AGI systems trained on lots of human data, or quasi-uploaded systems that are, point an AGI at lots of outputs of a human and some neural measurements and get something that at least kind of thinks of itself as being an echo of a person, or lots of artifacts on the continuum in between. I think transhumanists are likely to find it quite convincing, many of them, that these constructs in between them and just pure alien machine intelligence are as deserving of the label human as they are, and especially when it lines up with their desires for immortality and other very convincing personal interests. I think it will be quite easy for transhumanists, if I read it correctly, to take the attitude that existential risk, as we're talking about it, is not really exactly on the table, or at least not in the way we're saying it. I think they will see the risks quite differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder if post-human would be a better label, because I don't know exactly how these people would sort of say what is the bound, like when does it stop being human, and maybe that's the point, and like that's what they're going for, as opposed to transhuman, which is like maybe more associated with it sort of still having human characteristics, or coming from humans. But yeah, this is a good point that you raised, that it's possible to consider, even for long-termists, for example, that our descendants will be, will include the AI systems that we create, potentially. And that's an interesting take. This was the other thing that I wanted to bring it back to in the discussion of transhumanism and the discussion of kind of pushback that it gets, is I think there's like people who this is outside the Overton window for, maybe their reaction is just a gut reaction, like, oh my God, that sounds like weird and terrible. And they haven't the transhumanist might think, oh, but you haven't thought about it. Like if you actually sort of became comfortable with an idea, you might realize that I'm right, that, this could be just as beautiful as the world that we live in. Whereas I think I think maybe some of the pushback is kind of just like not being comfortable with it. But I think there is like a coherent pushback against the transhumanist sort of thing, which says, well, that's all well and good if we get it right, if we build something that doesn't, that actually meets these kind of goals that you're imagining. And I think that it's reasonable to sort of say or think that that's going to be harder than it might seem, because there's for example, a lot of pain and suffering that has gone in throughout millions of years to get humans to be kind of like a coherent, balanced sort of species on the world. And we could be in for, a lot of pain and suffering going forward if we want to make further radical changes to life on Earth. So, and not to mention that, you could also just try and build something that ends up killing everyone and then ends up sort of dying itself or something like that. Because, it's hard to build things that are going to actually survive, because you need to be very robust, and it's hard to build things that are very robust. So I think that's kind of like if you take a view of okay, maybe if we could create something better than humans, we should do that. Maybe you can agree with that, but then still think we shouldn't be accelerationist, because what's most likely to happen is that we're just likely to screw it up really bad. So that's also part of my opinion on that. But yeah, I think that's a coherent position that might come sort of to more prominence.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I would, as I think through this, I sort of see three major categories of scenario that seem to be the scenarios that people are concerned about and want to avoid. Maybe four. Certainly, I think we can maybe think through the different quadrants and through the different. Dan's probably pulling his hair out here because we haven't filled out the whole thing. We haven't gotten to that part yet. So maybe I'm jumping ahead. But let me just at least say that we could think about what bad outcomes are envisioned by these different interests spread through the four quadrants here, and what their reasoning is behind what they're trying to avoid, what bad outcomes they're trying to avoid. And the transhumanist community has some that I've heard discussed. The perhaps is a little bit more sophistication there because there's more openness and just long time exposure to thinking about new technologies in that community than perhaps, for example, the general public is today. So perhaps those concerns are a little bit more well informed, more nuanced. But I think like we should probably be a little more specific about what we mean by existential risk, for example, because there are a few different ways that can manifest. So, Dan, do you want me to list those things now, or do you want me to like table those for until we get a little more further through filling out this matrix? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I had so much more to add to the matrix, but maybe before we do that, I think that's a good framing. But I want to go back to the reason for doing this in the first place and just say one sentence about that. So this is not abstract or in the future what politics is tied up in this. This is right now. I mean, I have former students emailing me saying they have friends in politics, in economics, who want to get their heads around what's happening. They're not asking for my opinion directly, but maybe they soon will be, or maybe they'll ask you, or like these are issues that are here now, right? We have people giving speeches in parliaments about existential risk from AI. And it's kind of play acting to the community to some degree. I don't know how deeply held it is, but it will, the year has just started and there's a lot more to come. So by the end of this year, I think this will be a major factor, not only in geopolitics, where it is already a major factor, right? I mean, podcasts I listen to that talk about Chinese politics and tech are talking, every second episode about, well, who controls TSMC, right? These issues are already on the table in geopolitics. So this is like how to make sense of the world today. And in that vein, I'd like to communicate a quote from a Substack of Eric Hole. I don't know his background exactly, but he's written about AI recently, and he pointed out that it's a little disheartening to see some of the dejected attitudes from the AI safety community. I think some of you know what I'm referring to. Partly because there are many things that could be tried that haven't been tried. So we could try to regulate big tech by putting liability on the table for the outputs of large language models, for example. I mean, regulation and anti-competition investigations really did stop Microsoft from its rising any further than it did back in the 90s. Similar things could be done, but those are political questions, and you need to convince politicians and, for example, the Supreme Court that these are the right things to do. So these are the kinds of actions that one might take right now if you're concerned about AI safety. There are technical issues you could pursue, but there are also governance issues. And how you change people's minds in these different camps, one way or the other, depending on whether you're an accelerationist or a Kubernetes, these are things that are going to be dominating people's attention this year, right? So I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is an active debate. And I sort of want to wrap my head around what answer to give to people who ask me about this kind of thing. So on the topic of the quadrants, I don't know. I mean, is there anything to put in the bottom right? I think we didn't really have a good answer to that last time. Jordan Peterson. Yeah, that's actually a very good example. Correct.
Yeah, he recently, I saw some quotes from him that say something like, basically expressing like, this is going to be huge, and we better be careful because we could create a hell on earth, or we could create a heaven on earth sort of thing. And obviously, I don't think I need to justify why he's on the right side, although I guess it's more of a social right that I'm appealing to there.
Yeah, I think I would. Let's see.
I'm trying to think who would general groups. I mean, social conservatism and liberalism is not really the lens I was thinking of so much here. I mean, I guess voting blocks, yes, there's some associations, but I think the one of the interesting things about Jordan Peterson, maybe it's not the highest profile part of his sort of notoriety, is that he's extremely religious, and so religion And the official positions of the major religions of the world may well fall on that right quadrant. I mean, is the Catholic Church accelerationist on AGI? I don't know. I don't think so. What is the what is the position of the evangelical Christian community or the Muslim community on these things? My guess is if history is anything to judge by, they will tend to be conservative, tend to want to preserve the status quo and the structures around which the benefits accrue to these religious institutions. Certainly, their ideologies are a bit stuck in the mud and being ancient and very, 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 very slow to update. And they're, at least in the United States, it may be different elsewhere, but in the United States, religion is strongly associated with the political right. And
it is called the Butlerian Jihad.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's an interesting nuance there that somebody drew my attention to it. Some online quote drew my attention to that particular idea recently, and it's relevant to this conversation. It was relevant to one of the things I was going to mention, and I've got a list of 5 things now in front of me here about how we define existential risk. But there was a nuance in the idea of the Butlerian Jihad. This is just for, I think we probably all know, but just for anybody else listening, the Butlerian Jihad is an idea in Frank Herbert's book Dune, and that world that he created, and it was a event that took place in the dim history preceding the events in the book, and as a result of this event, the further development of artificial intelligence was forbidden socially, became socially taboo and very strictly enforced. And I don't remember the exact quote. It was something like, "Thou shalt not create a machine in the likeness of a person's mind," or something like that. And but the nuance that was interesting there is that it wasn't that the machines were taking over everything and that was so horrible. It turns out it was that some groups were using the machines to enslave other groups of people. So it was still human beings abusing the power of the technology that was the problem, as we've seen with other technologies, concerns about other technologies in the past. It was not that, at least in my understanding of the canon of the Dune universe, is that it was not about an AI uprising, an uprising of sentient machines that wanted their rights, a la the Matrix, but rather it was massively powerful tools that were empowering one group of people to control and subjugate other groups of people, and that was what was abhorrent, which is interesting. And of course, it's also interesting to remember that Dune, the first one anyway, was written in the 1960s. So Frank Herbert probably was thinking about computers in general, and not specifically about not necessarily specifically about agentic AGI as we now think of it. He was the idea of what computers were as thinking machines that could do play chess or do mathematics or help you with a spreadsheet or those sorts of things. That was all just computers, and that was all in artificial intelligence in the 1960s. And the nuances have emerged since then, and AI has become more and more exclusively defined as things that are not mere mechanization of computational processes, but are something closer to what we would think of nowadays as intelligence. But 70 years ago, that wasn't necessarily a clear distinction. So there's a fun nuance there, and that does point straight to this first item on my list of existential concern or existential risk, which is that, and this is, I think, a prominent public concern right now, and that is that this technology could be used to empower small groups of people, hugely empower them at the expense of others, and that the result would be inequality. There could certainly also be economic inequality resulting from job loss, where many people can no longer earn a living because they can't compete with artificial intelligence. And so the general concern is that there is social disruption and chaos and a great deal of suffering resulting from inequality enabled by these new technologies. And that is what, it turns out, the Butlerian Jihad was really about, was the inequality of it. the differential, the power differentials, and the lack of any distributional equity and justice in that sense. So I think that's a plausible, but perhaps a little bit short-sighted concern, right? I mean, that's not necessarily a concern that is completely salient with respect to artificial superintelligence, for example. It's something that makes more sense with narrow AI and less sense as you go up the scale from there. But at any rate, it seems to be top of the list of people's concerns about this new technology right now. I can pause there. I've got 4 other things on a list about adding nuance to the idea of existential risk here that it probably is relevant, especially, because then we could think through these 4 quadrants and how each of them views the various risks that are involved. And I'm sure I'm not thinking all of them, but I've got a few others. But I can pause if that's worth it.
Well, I'll just add one interesting startup idea. I mean, if you start a cult which has AGI as its deity, that would be a good way of getting the attention of the old religions, and then they'll ban AGIs and mobilize their billions of followers. That might be a very high leverage activity to try.
There you go. Yeah.
Go on, Adam.
Okay. Well, the second. So I should say that the very first concern is the general concern at the widest or largest unit of analysis, and that is just suffering. People are worried about suffering. People are worried that this technology will bring more suffering into the world rather than alleviate suffering. And it will be like you said, Dan, earlier, something of a Faustian bargain where it seems like a great idea and seems like it might have all these benefits, but there's a terrible, terrible price to pay for realizing those benefits. And there may be unintended consequences that could be dreadful, as we've seen with some other technologies. So that is probably the largest, the supervening or overarching concern is that this new technology could just make things worse. And it could result in the suffering of human beings and perhaps the suffering of new kinds of minds as well. So that would be a terrible outcome. If we created artificial minds and then they suffered, that would be dreadful. Okay. I mentioned inequality. That seems to be a major concern, and that this could reach catastrophic, nightmarish, dystopian levels. This is sort of the Judge Dredd kind of scenario. Those sorts of dystopian futures where you have people living in walled cities or walled compounds, and then it's a Mad Max style wasteland on the other side of the wall.
Sorry to interrupt, but could you give me we're enumerating what exactly, like underlying existential.
So what are people worried about? Well, they're worried about negative outcomes, and some of these outcomes are perceived to be existential. And existential, I mean, we can define what we mean by that, but threatening human civilization as a whole. I don't necessarily interpret existential risk to mean the human race must go extinct to the last man, woman, and child, but rather that it could result in the catastrophic setback of human civilization to a much more primitive state of organization, let's say. So you knock us back into the Dark Ages, for example, some dreadful outcome like that. So there's an existential risk would be something that almost every living human being could agree would be an outcome to be avoided. But we have to dig into that a little bit too if we want a really clear definition of existential risk. But I'm just saying, that I'm being more broad than that and just saying, what are the really bad outcomes that we're trying to avoid here that we are worried about, and that the different and I think people in the different quadrants are worried about different things. So like I said, the big overarching one is that it could increase the amount of suffering in the world. A subset of that is that it could grossly increase the amount of inequality in the world, and that you could have people living amazing lives, or transhumans, who are immortal, living lives of unimaginable bliss and luxury, and still children starving in the streets outside the walled cities and outside the walled compounds, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of inequality, that sort of dystopian, very common trope in science fiction and entertainment these days, is that those sorts of dystopian unequal futures. But for going the next couple things maybe a little more interesting. One is, of course, the concern about human genocide. That this is, you have the Eliezer Yudkowskis of the world that think, well, the AI it will be so powerful, especially if it's artificial superintelligence, that it would have the means to wipe out humanity without much work, without much effort, some bioweapon or whatever, or the Terminator scenario where the Skynet decides to just launch all the nukes in the world and kill us that way. So that's the idea that there might be a genocide of human beings, that we might all die. Obviously, that would be bad from most people's perspective. But now these other ones, these two are perhaps a little more interesting and less obvious, and I think they get a lot less discussion. And so the next one, number, I guess, 4, is the concern that AGI may have such alien goals that sorry, not just alien goals, but alien and primitive and worthless, useless, trivial, horrible goals, like the proverbial paperclip maximizer. And this is, I think Nick Bostrom has argued for, is it the orthogonality thesis? This is the idea that that intelligence and values are orthogonal; they're not correlated necessarily, and that you could have a super intelligent system that wanted to pursue some extremely stupid goal. And I've for a variety of reasons, I don't find that logic particularly compelling. But this is a concern. This is the idea that AI could be could be hyper competent, but either be completely fixated in what we would consider a mentally ill way, with pursuing a trivial goal, like turning the universe into paperclips, for no damn good reason, or perhaps a subtle and even more nightmarish shade of this is that you could have a super hyper competent system that wasn't actually awake or aware or conscious in some sense, right? So this is no lights on, nobody home scenario, where you have a hyper competent system. It's functionally super intelligent and extremely powerful, but there's nobody there. There's no self-awareness. There's no sapience. There's no sentience. It's not conscious. There's no self. There's no thing. It's just still an unthinking mechanistic system, but the system as a whole is just competent, and that system could pursue a terrible goal.
Oh, but that seems separate. I mean, it seems like a good thing to me if it's not conscious. I mean, I would be terrifically happy to discover that consciousness in AI systems is impossible. Because if it is possible, our options for dealing ethically with these systems seem even more fraught and difficult to imagine.
Well, I've not. I mean, I guess I've been persuaded a little bit more in the direction of it being plausible in recent years. I've heard some interesting arguments that a system could be competent without necessarily doing any self-modeling, having no metacognition, not thinking about itself or modeling itself or anything like that. But I still don't find that particularly plausible. I think it is very difficult to become hyper competent without.
Well, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm not talking about whether it's plausible or not. Maybe I also think it's highly likely consciousness will emerge in some sense. That seems. I have a strong argument against that. But you were saying you were attaching a value to that and saying you hope that's true, or you think that its failure would be a problem.
Well, I should say that I should attach that to a scenario, which is a one nightmarish scenario, and I guess it is the paperclip scenario potentially, perhaps even slightly worse. And that is that it's one thing if you had just sort of a crazed, insane machine mind that just wanted to turn things into paperclips, but it was still self-aware, and it was just insane. But at least the lights were on and somebody was home, and it wiped out humanity and turned us all into paperclips and everything else in the solar system. And that would be a bad outcome. But what would be an even worse outcome would be if that same thing happened and we all got turned into paper clips by an unthinking, unconscious, nobody, no lights on, nobody home, not even insane, just dead machine.
Okay.
That's the distinction there. And I have, I've heard, I mean, this is all part of the conversations over the years that I've observed. Okay, and so sorry, just one last thing, and then we can kind of have a, maybe freely explore all these different things and add more to the list. But the one other one that I'm aware of is there is concern about the sort of wirehead hedonium kind of scenario where AGI or artificial superintelligence sort of misinterprets the human aspirations and goals, and instead of giving us a rich and experience, which is where real fulfillment and reward and value, at least we like to tell ourselves, who knows, it's hard to evaluate, hard to know for sure, but we like to tell ourselves that it is the richness and complexity in life that is fulfilling and meaningful, and that meaning is more important than pleasure, and that meaning comes from a complex admixture of pleasure and pain and sacrifice and work and reward and the context of all of those things together, forming a larger picture, a more meaningful picture. And that instead, you could have a scenario where in trying to do the best for humanity, this is one fun, scenario, the artificial intelligence just, plugs us all into heroin drips and or some other kind of crude, primitive, but nevertheless hyper hedonic kind of state. So I've also heard, like one extreme version of this is that we're all uploaded into computronium substrate, but that computronium is just maximized to experience pleasure, and that's it. And that's called hedonium, as opposed to computronium that just maximizes pleasure is called hedonium. I've heard that. I can't remember where or by whom, so I can't attribute it. But that seems to be, from many people's perspective, a dystopian outcome. It's probably not the worst of them. I mean, there are worse ones. Being tortured for all eternity by Rocco's basilisk or something would be worse. But the idea that the richness and complexity and meaning of experience would be lost in favor of a more superficial pursuit of just pleasure and hedonic experience, that is that's another bad outcome that people seem to be concerned about and are hope that we will be able to avoid.
Sure. Yeah, we have to wrap up in a few minutes.
I think you mentioned some of the other things before, Dan. Just one more quick thought, and that is that a lot of these are not exclusive. Like this, it's possible that some of these could occur simultaneously, and it's possible that humanity could experience one of these terrible outcomes, but that it might still be justifiable if at the same time you had a new race or whatever of artificial minds, or perhaps a single artificial intelligence, whose experiences are so much deeper and more profound than ours that it would be worth it, and that we should think of those things as like our descendants or our children, and that it doesn't matter if we suffer or die, because we will have given birth to something more better and bigger and more meaningful and more profound than ourselves, and that would be okay. And so there are circumstances in which multiple of these bad outcomes could happen simultaneously, either with each other or simultaneously with a justifiably good outcome, an outcome so good that it would justify the terrible outcome alongside it. That's what I mean.
I guess we'll have to wrap up in a minute or two. Matt, do you have anything you want to add before we do that?
Yeah, maybe a closing remark would be something like, there's like a pretty compelling story that the people in the accelerationist camp tell. This sort of also gets back to Adam's comments before about the kind of the strategic perils of being in a counterculture or like an anti-movement where you're just sort of denying things. It's not like a story that is inspiring because it's about destruction rather than creation. So the accelerationists have their story where they're like, look at all of the good things in the world and just imagine more of that faster for everyone. How could you say no to that? And I don't know, I've been trying to think without that much success, but I'll keep thinking about a positive story for the Kubanites to get behind, and it would be what I've got so far is it's something like, okay, agreed we want all of the good stuff now. That's we can agree on that. And the story is that the best way to do that, or something like imagine this story that the accelerationists are selling you, but it's not the AGIs that do everything for us. It's we who are empowered to do everything for ourselves, or something like that. Keep the humans at the helm and make all of your technological inventions such that they empower humans to be the best versions of themselves. So instead of mining their preferences and then putting them into a model, help them to form more coherent and sort of have deeper reflection on the preferences that they want to have. Instead of building systems that can solve all of the problems for us, build systems that can work with humans to help them solve all the problems that they want to solve. And then hopefully, if humans are sort of in the loop in this kind of fundamental way and are empowered, then we can sort of have a a positive outcome in terms of moving towards this sort of utopia that people seem to be thinking might be possible with this kind of technology. If anyone else has other positive stories that we can try and have on our minds, because it's pretty hard to counter someone when they say, but don't you want all of the good stuff all of the time now?
Yeah, I think it's not as exciting.
I think one way to...
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to communicate an anecdote from Stuart Russell likes to address this by saying that it's no good having a field of bridge builders if you don't have as part of bridge building the activity of not falling down. So it's actually kind of like a false proposition to talk about accelerationism without doing it correctly. It's just suicide.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah,
while I agree with that, while I agree with that, I think at the level of competition of narratives, I think Stuart still loses, frankly, without some additional ideas. Sorry, go on, Ed.
Well, I was just going to say that there will be contention, perhaps even competition, among different visions for what a good outcome could be, right? So I think I listed I listed a few categories of bad outcomes. It might be worth maybe next time thinking through the spectrum of different good outcomes and how they're envisioned, because an outcome that's good from one perspective or from one person's point of view or one group's point of view might be a terrible outcome from another point of view. And so this is a precaution about it goes back a long way in history. Be careful what you wish for; you might get it. And this, you need some sort of level of some meta level there, right? Where the greater wisdom would be, and I think Matt was alluding to this. It would, and I think some AI alignment work is headed in this direction, and that is what we need to get better at is not realizing our values that we currently possess, but rather we need to get much better at developing and discerning the values themselves and knowing which things ought to be pursued. And so, as an ancient idea, the ideas of paradise that are in the world's religions, they're not very exciting to a modern person. Right? I mean, what if you take the literal definitions and descriptions of heaven from, the Abrahamic religions, for example, you wouldn't want to live there. There's no Wi-Fi, there's no smartphones, there's no Netflix, there's milk and honey, and that's great. And if you're a man, there's 72 virgins in some of the scenarios. If you're a woman, all you get is your husband back. In some of these scenarios, right? It's not like there's just a giant Chippendales club for your blissful attention or whatever. So we have to be, I suppose, cognizant of the fact that the optimal or the and maybe not even optimal, but just the good scenarios, the good outcomes that we can imagine right now, are almost certainly not anywhere near actually optimal outcomes. And there are some groups that are well aware of this and that are talking about that, and saying, well, we need to maximize our ability to explore the possibility space that opens up, and that's what we really need to be doing. But if you look down in this bottom right scenario, or even in the top right scenario, certainly in the bottom left, I mean, I can think of a whole lot of conflicting good outcomes described by those different actors in those different entities, right? With these different groups. So, like, what's a good outcome to an environmentalist, an anti-tech environmentalist, is nothing like the good outcome for a techno-utopian or a transhuman, a transhumanist person. And so there's likely to be a great deal of conflict and contention in these different visions of the future. So it's hard to steel man a positive, affirmative case, a single one. I think Matt did a great job of that, but we could probably imagine what some of these folks are thinking of when they're thinking of, this is an ideal outcome. It might be fun to think through, to walk through those different scenarios and then to kind of evaluate them against one another.
Who cares, as long as I decide. Okay, we should wrap up here, but thanks everybody. Next time let's talk about that. Let's revisit the Manhattan Project, or I guess we can recall briefly how that started, what the signs of that were, and talk about what that might look like this time. I think, as Adam mentioned, there's a big distinction between the kind of people who would contribute to the Manhattan Project. They were accessible in universities, and the kind of people who might contribute now are harder to pick up because they're sitting inside tech companies and maybe harder to poach without people noticing. So let's come back to that. But we'll stop there for today. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, guys. We'll speak next time.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. That was really interesting.
Okay, so we're going to move down to the venue for Euclid.